Hello. Okay. I'm not sure if something's wrong with your audio. I heard there's like a little sputter for a second there.
Testing.
Oh yeah, it's good.
All right, beautiful.
How you doing today?
I am doing excellent. Busy, but good.
Okay, cool. Um, so we're gonna be reviewing a 538 podcast today, which is something we have not done before. So, have you got the link for that?
Yep. All right. Let me see. So let's up here and then get the streaming going.
This caught my attention because the title of the podcast kind of tied into something that we were talking about on our last show that we did together, which is we were watching a documentary on the 2008 financial crisis, and then we were talking about like the effect that might have had on people being like pessimistic or cynical about U.S. politics, and apparently that is exactly what this podcast is about. Not specifically about 2008, but about
Mhm.
pessimism and
Yeah, I'm a big 538 fan already, and this is a subject that I'm really interested in, and I think is really underappreciated for how significant it is. So I'm really curious to hear like what these people who I think are a lot smarter than me think about it.
okay, cool. Yeah, I don't know. Your VTuber doesn't appear to be working, but that's okay.
Oh,
But
it's
you're
working on
this.
my screen.
Oh, really? Yeah, I can't see it. You know what I'm gonna do? I'm gonna leave the call for a second, and then I'll come back and I'll see if it works.
Okay, go for it.
Still not working for me. Oh well, whatever. That's fine. We can just watch the
Here,
video.
I can try just.
Hey.
All right, trying to turn my video on and crash my Discord. So
Oh.
okay, well, it's on now. I don't know
Oh.
if it's showing up for you still or not.
It is. Yes.
Uh,
We've got a llama.
I had to go through one crash, but now we're on the other side of it.
Okay.
Okay, let me just test that
Do
sound
you
working for
ever
you.
get
Uh, Sounds
confused
pretty
for Nate
good.
Silver?
I
Like, do
think I
people
got.
ever email your?
I might even have to turn it down slightly, but yeah.
Do you ever get confused for Nate Silver? Like, do people ever email your Times address and say, like, I don't know why your model says like this, but
I almost never get feedback through like professional channels that suppose that I'm Nate Silver. I do if I like meet someone for the first time and I like explain what my job is and that my name is Nate, like there's often an effort to either figure out which one I am, or also people just know who Nate Silver is because he's more famous than I am. So like I'd be like, no, he left the Times, that's not me, that sort of thing definitely happens. But it's not, I think it becomes less common over time.
on behalf of 538, I'm sorry for the confusion, and I'm glad to hear that it's decreased. Hello and welcome to the 538 Politics Podcast. I'm Galen Druk. For folks who are interested in what Americans think about the state of our country and its politics, we got lots of new data from the New York Times and Siena College last week. They released their first round of midterms polling covering a wide range of questions, from views on Biden and Trump to the state of the economy and our democracy. The answer to just about all of those questions is not great. Americans are pretty pessimistic. And they're pessimistic about both the direction of the country and the people leading both parties. For regular listeners, or really perhaps any American, that might not be surprising. But beyond the pessimism, we also learned how Americans want things to be different, from some clues for future elections to how the parties' coalitions could continue to evolve. And here with us to unpack all of that is Nate Cohn, the chief political analyst at the New York Times, who heads up the Times Siena poll. Welcome back to the podcast, Nate.
Thank you. It's good to be back.
Also here with us is 538 Politics editor Sarah Frostenson. Hey, Sarah.
Hey, y'all.
Before we dive in, I do want to mention a little housekeeping at the top. So this week and next week, we're only going to have one podcast per week. I am going on vacation, so I invite all of you to join me by going outside and thinking about things that have nothing to do with politics. Of course, still listen to our one podcast that does come out, but then I will be back and we will pick back up with 2 podcasts a week. The other thing I should mention, I heard from some listeners that for some reason last Thursday's podcast showed up as a repeat of Monday's podcast on some platforms. I'm not sure why that happened, but if you want to hear all about Georgia politics with Greg Bluestein, the correct podcast is posted in the Apple Podcast app. You can also, of course, watch the podcasts on YouTube. Okay, we've got all of that out of the way. Nate, we usually begin with a good or bad use of polling. We will not subject the Times Siena poll to this treatment. I think it's fair to say that it is a good use of polling. Thank you for, spending all of that time and energy trying to figure out what Americans think about a whole host of things. We are still going to have a good or bad use of polling segment today, though, and we are going to focus in on a recent Morning Consult poll. So, are you ready to play along with good use or bad use of polling?
I am ready.
All right, we love to hear it. So, last week, the latest consumer price index data showed that prices had risen 9.1% over the past year, which was similar to past recent months, a 40-year high. Morning Consult also released a poll last week showing that 2 out of 3 voters think that the United States is currently in a recession. Of course, economic data comes in at a delay, but as far as we know, and according to the most recent projections from economists, we are not currently in a recession. Nonetheless, that 2/3 number is higher than the 51% of Americans who said the country was in a recession in the spring of 2020, when the country was actually in a recession and we were seeing an unprecedented surge in layoffs. We've talked about this kind of polling to some extent before on the podcast, but I'm curious, is it a good use of polling to ask Americans a factual question like, are we in a recession? And does the seemingly inaccurate response from Americans tell us something useful? Sarah, I'll let you kick us off to show Nate how it's done. Is this a good or bad use of polling?
Okay, I would actually say it's a good use of polling. And that's because when it comes to perceptions of the economy, research has found time and again that public perceptions are often closely correlated with the actual economic conditions. As you were saying, Galen, it's really challenging to predict a recession. Economists were horribly off when it was trying to understand the impact of the coronavirus in 2020. But research suggests that regular people have an understanding of what woes and problems they're facing on a daily basis when it comes to buying goods, what it's like in the economy. And also keep in mind, a recession can only be classified retrospectively. We could be in a recession right now if the second quarter of GDP is down. And I think the last point I would make is that there's also evidence that media coverage around the economy, around recessions, often follows public opinion versus media coverage setting how people think about the economy. And so what that all boils down to is I think a lot of times when people say that they are facing real economic woes, you should take that at face value, because whether or not that macro is true, it will affect how they vote.
Interesting.
I think it's a really good point, and one that I think is sometimes people don't like to acknowledge, but it's like, if a significant part of the country thinks that the sky is green, even if it's blue, you gotta have some response to that.
Yeah, the perception alone is important. Yeah. Also, I mean,
Do you agree?
It's kind of like, why do we even care about a recession in the first place? Is because it affects a lot of people's lives, and if a lot of people feel that their lives are being affected in that same way, then I think that's probably more important than whether we really are in a recession or not.
Yep, I think there's this meme that talks about a world more gooder because line go up. That something I don't really like a lot as a neoliberal, but there is some truth to the fact that you need to make sure that if Wall Street is doing good, Main Street is also doing good. Something like President Obama talked about, and there is some truth to the idea that generally more economic growth does legitimately massively improve people's lives. But there can be cases where, due to weird circumstances, a lot of people's quality of life is still declining, even though we might be doing economically well. And it's important to identify those situations and make sure that you're not missing that.
Yeah, and also the kind of technical definition of a recession that they were using, where like if GDP declines year over year, or over a 3-month period. I mean, this is just a little bit disconnected from how most people think of a recession. I think they just kind of think of it as like, oh, is the economy doing bad?
Yeah.
And so if there's like a lot of inflation, for example, people that could get people to perceive the economy as doing bad, like all their expenses are going up, regardless of whether the GDP is up or down year over year.
Which is kind of ironic, because I mean, like, the classic thing of a recession that you'll want to try and avoid is like a deflationary spiral. So it's just kind of ironic that is the exact opposite. But no, I 100% agree. People's views on the economy can often be just as important as the economy itself, and it's something that you have to be cognizant of where these perceptions coming from. Because if half the country thinks the economy isn't doing well for them, something's going on. There probably isn't that level of mass delusion.
I think I do. I'll say it's an okay use of polling, just to be a little contrarian, but I think it's useful right now. As a general proposition, I don't know how useful it is. I think it's true that the recession is a technical term that Americans only have a very imperfect understanding of. I do think it tells us that many Americans think the economy is bad, but I would rather just ask them if they think economic conditions are good or bad, or poor or something like that. That's what the Times Siena poll does. But at this particular moment, I do think that there is an insight to be gleaned from this question, because as Sarah mentioned, there is a case that we are in a recession right now. I could be misspeaking, so I probably shouldn't be saying this, but I'll go ahead and say anyway that I think someone told me that maybe the Atlanta Fed had a paper that suggested we were already in a recession. And so it's possible that in the weeks ahead that there could be a determination that we are in a recession. There could be media coverage to that effect. And if voters already believe we're in a recession, then that might attenuate some of the political consequences of that kind of decision. And it won't be surprising news to the American public. And I'm glad to know that.
Yeah, so I guess I should say the way that this polling response was framed by Morning Consult is that for all we know, we aren't in a recession. No one has declared that we're in a recession. And so we're sort of framing this as a notable result because more Americans think that the economy is contracting than thought the economy was contracting when we knew that it was back in spring of 2020. Nate, you found also in your Times and Siena College polling that Americans are more pessimistic now than they were at certain points throughout 2020 when, for example, we were in recession, when coronavirus was raging and people weren't vaccinated. Like, why? Does it all boil down to inflation?
I can't succinctly answer the question why. It seems to me like there are at least two factors that I would point to, though. One is it seems like most of the movement is among Republicans. Republicans in 2020 continued to believe that the economy was in fundamentally good straits, and they do not believe that today. You could attribute that to the effects of partisanship, that Donald Trump was the president at the time. You could attribute it, and that Joe Biden is now, or you could attribute it to a second possibility, which is that there is a case that maybe the fundamentals of the economy are more clearly problematic today than they were in March and April of 2020. In March and April of 2020, I could imagine telling myself a story that said the economy is fundamentally fine, but it's sort of on pause at the moment because of the coronavirus, and that if the coronavirus wasn't here, things would magically snap into place. Many Democrats believe that, after all. That was sort of the theory of why things might be looking pretty good for the Democrats politically if Joe Biden became the president and if the coronavirus could be brought under control. I think today that notion is a lot more challenging to sustain. The coronavirus is no longer as much of a drag on the economy, and it's exposed more deep and fundamental distortions than simply a suppression of demand due to quarantines and other measures to stop the spread. So I think I can imagine a credible case that someone could believe that the fundamentals of the economy are weaker today, or have been demonstrated to be weaker today than they were understood to be at the time. or understood to be in April 2020.
Yeah, absolutely. Who thought like 2 years after the first start of the lockdowns in the US, we would still be in this position where a lot of white collar workers are still working remotely, people,
All of us, it seems.
all of us currently. And then, right, like, right now there's infections of the coronavirus, not as deadly in some instances thanks to vaccinations, but still, like, life is disrupted. I think that shapes then pessimism that people have. Because I think, Galen, we were talking maybe, I think after the first wave of vaccinations, a lot of polling was suggesting that Americans were really optimistic about the direction the country was headed. But that was before the Delta variant, before the Omicron variant. And I think, as Nate was saying, like, we've seen then real fractures exposed in our economy and how that works. And one thing I would note is it's not just Republicans who are souring on the economy. One thing we found, there's been this debate in political science about how much of the economy is shaped by partisans' views, with the idea being that, right, if a Democrat's in the White House, a Republican is sour then on the economy. But one thing we've seen with Biden's low approval numbers is Democrats, too, are upset about the economy. And in fact, according to the University of Michigan's survey of consumer sentiment data, they show that Democrats currently have the lowest view of the economy now than they did at any point in Trump's presidency. So I do think there are real economic factors, regardless of partisanship, that are being shaped and how people think about the economy now.
Yeah, it is interesting to parse how much of people's perceptions are based on partisanship and how much is based on reality, because we do know that economic perceptions are sort of affected by partisanship. So in this Morning Consult poll, we see that in spring of 2020, 66% of Democrats thought that we were in a recession, whereas now it's 53%. So that has gone down slightly over, that period of time. Republicans, on the other hand, 37% thought that we were in a recession in March of 2020. 78% think we're in a recession now. That is sort of indicative of, I think, partisanship to a certain degree. So, like, given that, does that dampen how much we should expect this sort of like whether or not we're in a recession question to ultimately shape spending and behavior and sort of, because there is this argument that, like,
can we pause for a second?
Like you said, Sarah.
So these numbers on the kind of partisan effect of issue diagnosis, those numbers are not surprising to me, but I kind of wish they were, right? Because this is just a unfortunate thing that I think we know that just about American politics that just bleeds into every single issue that we talk about, which is that all of it is just poisoned by this, like, tribalism and people just trying to say the right thing to align with the political group that they belong to.
Yeah, I think the need to score a point on every issue is really damaging because it makes it really hard for people to admit when their side is wrong or to just acknowledge like some descriptive reality. I think you see this a lot when it comes to like the coronavirus, for example, where there was like I think Trump had these insistences that like, oh, we're fine, we're doing fine when things are not fine. And I think that it is a really big problem that just keeps getting bigger. And I'm not really sure what the correct solution is. The funny thing, I think, in regards to this polling on Biden and the economy is that a big part, some of the analysis I've seen is that a big part of it is the fact that Biden very much is disliked by significant groups on the left wing that are a lot more like radical. Or
Oh, I think your audio is
in a way that's Trump.
Okay, never mind. Sorry, you're back.
No. It's just that Biden's polling is uniquely depressed by the fact that he isn't just dealing with Republicans that don't like him, but there's a significant group on the left that also don't like him, the much more progressive wing, more in sort of in line with like AOC or even like Elizabeth Warren, and that as a result, Biden doesn't have like a very sort of strong fanatical base that sort of can shore up his polling numbers.
Right. So, also, like, I think a lot of the way that people answer these questions, it isn't even just that they're considering their own circumstances and then like tilting one way or the other due to their political bias. I think that when people get asked if we're in a recession, that I I almost think that it seems like their answer is less even based on their own economic circumstances and more just what is the TV telling them about whether we're in a recession, right? And it's just, Republicans consume different media sources than Democrats, and of course the right-leaning media sources are going to be doom and gloom all the time when a Republican's not in office.
Yeah, I think there's a very much like a spin factor because I think there are still some underlying economic realities like inflation obviously is, we know, like objectively way up. I think it's a matter of sort of like what does that mean? Is inflation up because like the world is coming out of coronavirus? You have all this pent up demand. You have a massive shift versus like services versus goods. You still have like clogging up of international supply, or is it because dementia Joe Biden shut down the oil pipelines and and he's, I think that's where the spin really comes into effect, and you sort of see the divergence of partisan opinion.
Right. I mean, a media organization though that wants to, push one particular side of the political narrative though is also going to be inclined to just spin everything in a more negative way when they're out of power and in a more positive way when they're in power. So I don't know.
Yeah, and I think it's a really big problem. People remember negative stuff so much more than positive stuff. It's a huge, huge problem.
Right, and here we are with a nation full of pessimists about every issue. So yeah.
Believe people when they tell you the economy is bad, because even if we're not in a recession now, belief that we're in a recession could ultimately lead to a recession. But if what people are also expressing is just their partisanship, does that mean we should pay less attention?
That's a complicated question. I think, though, and this was actually something in the Times Siena poll, they showed, right, that among college-educated whites who identified as Democrats, only 17%, I believe, said that an economic concern was their top concern. I don't think there were breakouts among non-educated Democrats, but among, like, the non-educated Americans writ large, economic concerns were much more of an issue. And so I do think there's a tendency then, by just focusing in on partisanship, we're missing a lot of people who don't identify strongly as Democrat or Republican, but still go in and out of elections. And I think those are the people who are most affected by this and will probably vote most on that factor here in the 2022 midterms.
I think it's a really interesting question. I mean, imagine that the Democrats one day elect a Bernie Sanders or an Elizabeth Warren who strikes fear into the hearts of, plutocrats and business people in the country. Is that alone enough to plunge us into a recession nowadays because politics is strong enough to influence their attitudes about the economy and their likelihood of making investments? I mean, I have no idea. But I think that the more that politics appears to color people's perceptions of the economy, the more you can imagine some interesting economic fallout from changes in American politics.
All right. So all in all, we got a good use of polling from Sarah, an okay use of polling from Nate. On a 0 to 10 scale, where does that leave us? Like a 6 or a 7?
6.5.
6.5?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Fair enough. Well, let's get to a great use of polling and talk about the latest Times polling. As I mentioned, the Times and Siena College released their first round of midterm polling last week, and here are some of the top line numbers. Just 13% of Americans said the country is on the right track, and President Biden's approval rating came in at 33%. By the way, that's a bit lower than what the 538 average shows, which is 39%. The race for Congress is neck and neck, with the two parties tied in the low 40s. That's similar to what the 538 average shows, and both Biden and Trump have some weaknesses with their own party's voters. That's just a sampling of all of the information we got. We've got a lot more to dig into, but let's begin with this. Nate, what do you think was the most important thing that you learned from this initial round of midterm polling?
The most important overarching finding is that Americans aren't just more dissatisfied with the direction of the country, but that it's beginning to take a toll on their willingness to follow the usual conventions of American politics in different ways. They're likelier to say that they support major reforms to the fundamentals of the political system. They're less likely to support renominating Joe Biden for president, which is something you would usually expect. They're less likely to say that they think the last election, that Joe Biden was a legitimate winner of the last election. Donald Trump is less likely to have support from Republicans than he did 2 years ago. It just seems like that the general dissatisfaction with the direction of the country is undermining some of the usual assumptions that you could make. And it's not always causal. Like, I'm not going to argue that the direction of the country is the reason why Donald Trump is viewed more unfavorably than he was 2 years ago, or why Republicans cast doubt on the outcome of the last election. But I think it adds up to a much more pessimistic mood than even other points in recent history when we would usually characterize the public as in a pretty sour mood. We started asking different questions as a result. Like we were asking a new question on top of the right track, wrong direction question, asking people whether they're optimistic about whether the country can get back on the right track. And the majority of Americans said they were optimistic about that. So I think that's an important caveat for now. But in another year, I'm interested to see whether that flips and maybe people start doubting whether America can ever get back on the right track.
It's interesting hearing you say all of that. It strikes me as the kind of environment where pundits usually argue that a change style candidate would do very well. We will see if someone like that emerges. But Sarah, what stuck out to you the most in all of this data? Something similar or something different?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think on that note, the thing that stood out most to me was what it told us about the party's bases and the shifts we're seeing happen there. And it was particularly interesting, I think, what we see among Democrats, because one question I've had going into the midterms is, how much of what we saw in 2020 with Latino voters was more of a blip or a sign of a new trend? And I think this poll, along with other polls, is echoing that, this is a possible, dare I say, like realignment happening in terms of Latino voters identifying more with Republican voters. And I think it's a very dramatical coalitional shift that could potentially be underway with the party's voters. And just as we were talking about earlier in the first segment, how striking it is for how different Americans then, as a result, view different issues, right? Only 17% of white college educated Democrats saying that an economic issue was top of mind for them, whereas, lower income Americans were always saying that the economy was super important to them in that survey. And I think it just speaks to some of the divides Nate is highlighting in terms of the direction the country is moving in and just little agreement on what the best path forward should be.
Yeah, no,
I think there's a big mistake being made in that analysis, which is I don't think you can just talk about Latino voters because there are so many different groups that vote very differently. I think that it is a really good point to say that, there are segments of the Latino voting bloc that have much more stronger conservative leanings. I mean, I think it was George Bush who got 46% of the Hispanic vote in 2004. And when you talk about, like, for example, like Tejano communities in South Texas, very conservative, socially leaning, very religious, very much in a lot of respects like the archetypal like rural conservative voter, or like Cuban exiles in Florida, who obviously do not like the word socialism when they hear that. So I think there is definitely a strong, possibility for Republicans to get more votes from minority communities that are a lot more conservative if they could, just get over their racism problem. I think there's a great opportunity for there. But I think that also reflects the reason why just viewing the Latino voter group as just like a homogenous group is so problematic, because there is such a diversity in terms of, like, third generation immigrants that are part of sort of the second wave of Hispanic immigration to the U.S. from southern Mexico, from places like Mexico City, settling in like places like LA, versus, Tejanos that have been in Texas as, longer than it has been in the country. They're radically different groups, and need to be you need to have a much more specific analysis, I think.
Yeah, the diversity thing is a really good point. That I don't really have much to add about that one, but on the other point, the idea that that the Republican Party kind of shares a lot of conservative values with parts of the Latino community in the United States is something that we've been hearing for decades, and really, like, sometimes you hear that about black voters as well, like that it's kind of remarkable that they vote 90% Democratic when a lot of them have the similar conservative social values, but like you said, I think it's they're perceived as being this kind of like anti-minority party, and that's what seems to hold them back.
Yeah, I think it is. Republicans, I think both political sides' greatest weakness is always going to be the bad people on their side. And I mean, it is absolutely true that, I mean, if it wasn't for Republicans being so goddamn racist, and especially having a history, it's probably more fair to say that the Republican Party having a history of being very racist for a long time, that they would have had a much better path forward as time goes on. And only time will tell if they're able to get over that hurdle. For a while, there was discussion of, conservatives turning, the Hispanic community into an ally, especially with George Bush and even Mitt Romney. And then Trump comes along in 2016 and just blows that, completely out of the water. But now in 2020, he sort of tones down a lot of that immigration talk. I think was noticeably absent on the campaign trail in 2020. And all of a sudden, you start to see the ability for those conservative values to reach out to Hispanic voters start to show up. So it's a real sort of gamble, are we back on that path, or in 2024 are Republicans going to start talking about, illegal rapists crossing the border and just shoot themselves in the foot again?
So do you think our politics have actually become less ideological and more identitarian, or do you think that it's just that was always there and it's just getting uncovered by recent developments?
I definitely think it's a lot more ideological than identitarian. America is an amazing place because at the end of the day, people view themselves primarily, I think, as Americans, especially compared to the rest of the world where, I think it's telling that like American racists are talking about, yeah, white people. And then if you go to Europe, they're like, what's that? I'm Polish, I'm Swedish, stuff like that. I think, if you look at like contradictions and some like the alt-right movement figures, these guys who have like Jewish wives talking about like how the Holocaust was a fake and stuff. I think there is a great undercurrent of like, yeah, we can get along at the end of the day, no matter who you are, in all just sort of swaths of all walks of American life.
Do you think that that's just as true today as it was like 10 or 20 years ago, or do you think there's any
I
change?
think so, yeah. No, I think it is just as, and maybe a little bit more. I think it's
Really?
people hate each other a lot more today, but I don't think it's because of like, oh, you're this or that. It's just because like I have spent the last 15 hours on Facebook and I am ready to go destroy the enemy.
In a way, like I wonder if it's. I mean, it definitely seems like people have more of an emotional investment in politics today than they did 10 or 20 years ago. So I mean, maybe I framed the question badly because it could be that we're both more ideological and more identitarian than we were earlier.
Yeah, that's probably true. Yeah, I think there's definitely an increase on both of those, just because people are just so vitriolic and tribal now, along all lines. They're tribal along ideological lines. They're tribal along identitarian lines. I mean, they're it's just people are losing their minds, and they're gonna look for any. It feels like people are looking for almost any excuse to, mob, witch hunt or cancel or ruin someone's life over anything. People always go to the most extreme now. Republicans are, these like racist white supremacist rapists. Democrats are child groomers. Human trafficking. Yeah, I don't know. It's in certain respects it looks very bleak, but I still think there's good reason to be hopeful.
Okay. And are we on 1.25 speed? Is that what we're...
Yeah, I moved us at 1.5. I think is a little much.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, we're trying to finish up within the next 90 minutes. So that's.
I think that the class divide in the Democratic Party is one of the most important themes of the last 15 years of American politics, and it looks like the recent news events have driven it into overdrive. On the one hand, you have a weak economy that is continuing to erode Democratic support among working class voters who care about bread and butter economic issues and back the Democrats because they believe Democrats are on the side of working people. And on the other hand, we have an incredible month of news that has heightened every liberal Democratic concern you can come up with. The fate of democracy is at stake in January 6 hearings that are being aired every couple of weeks. Roe versus Wade was overturned. There's a spate of mass shootings. And that's doing everything you can imagine and more for the moment to energize white college-educated liberals. And I mean, liberals of all demographic groups, but that is predominantly white college graduates. And the result is that Democrats are doing better than ever among white college graduates, at least in this poll, and doing much worse than they've done before, in our surveys, at least among Latino and other non-black, non-white voters. It's interesting to me that Democrats are still, at least in this survey, holding up among black voters. I think it is worth cautioning that that these sample sizes are pretty small. Like we're talking about 110 black voters or Latino voters in a survey, maybe. So, maybe if we were to if we're going to redo the poll tomorrow, I mean, maybe Biden's approval rating would be a little healthier among Latino voters than our poll showed it. Maybe Democrats would stretch out a little bit more of a lead, maybe not. But broadly speaking, the overall trend lines are clear. They date back a decade. And it's easy to tell a story about why what's happening right now would only tend to exacerbate those long-term trends.
Yeah, we were going to wait a little bit later into the podcast to sort of dig into this realignment theme, but we're here, so let's just talk about it. You write, based on this poll, that for the first time in a Times Siena national poll, Democrats' share of support for college white graduates was higher than for non-white voters. So that's sort of like trends that we've seen, as you mentioned, for a decade or more, now getting to the point where like the two lines cross sort of on the graph. If this trend continues, where white college-educated voters who for a long time sort of served as somewhat of a base for the country club style Republican Party that we knew in maybe the 80s and 90s, even through Bush, if that part of the country increasingly votes for Democrats and that, voters of color start to become more evenly divided between the two parties. What does that mean long term for the two parties' coalitions, how they compete on the national map, what kinds of issues the parties maybe even campaign on or legislate on when they're in office? Like, how would this trend, if continuing along the lines that the Times Siena poll shows us, change our politics?
That is a very good and big question. One thing that I would add that I think is important to toss in is that the poll also shows further attenuation in Democratic support among white voters without a degree. Biden was down to like a 20% approval rate. I don't remember the number, but Democrats were at 23% among white voters without a degree. They were still at 24% among likely voters. So what we're really seeing is a cleavage between college graduates, and especially white college graduates, and people without a degree, and especially white voters without a degree. In terms of the structure of our electoral politics, it would tend to exacerbate the longer term trend towards growing Democratic disadvantages in the Senate and the Electoral College. White voters without a degree, white college graduates are concentrated in a relatively small number of states along the coasts and in a few large metro areas in the center of the country, like around Atlanta or Houston and Dallas. It should be noted that Democratic weakness among Latino voters might have a countervailing effect. Latino voters are also disproportionately concentrated in non-competitive states, and so you could imagine that Democratic losses among Latino voters cut away at Democratic margins to California and New York one day, and Illinois for that matter, and that maybe that would slightly cut against the overall negative trend. But that was true in 2022 with TOO after all. In 2020, Democrats lost a lot of ground among Latino voters, and that probably did prevent Democrats from being at a 5-point deficit in the tipping point state with respect to the national vote. But the overall trend line towards educational polarization is nonetheless pushing Democrats into a bigger structural hole in their fight for control of government. And I think you can already see the tensions playing out inside of government. The Democrats, the highly educated wing of the Democratic Party, just has very different priorities than the rest of the country. And that's not to say those priorities are wrong, but they're different. They're more abstract. They're based on, they depend on having a certain set of values and then a sort of almost quasi-scientific worldview that conceives of the way that we think about problems in terms of, inequality and different population level effects or climate change, these very abstract and very important concerns, but ones that are difficult to connect with, more mundane, everyday realities at the individual level. And it can put the Democrats in a position like the one they're in now, where their governing priorities are not necessarily aligned with the electorate. And I think that's where the conditions for populism come from. When a large group of people don't believe that their needs and desires are being met by politicians in Washington, and that makes it possible for an outsider to sort of claim they're going to represent the people. So I think that we're already seeing some of these trends play out. Resurgent populism seems like a very natural consequence of a highly educated, technocratic group of voters with abstract concerns prevailing over decision-making in DC.
It raises, though, I think, really interesting questions around how the two parties then are going to message themselves, right? The Democratic Party has long been the party of unionization of the working class voter. As Nate points out, though, it has shifted away from that, right? But that doesn't mean there's been a lot of efforts among Republicans, right, around this idea that they will now be the party of the working class, but they haven't necessarily become more pro-union or more friendly around lower economic class proposals that would boost people's standing in society. And I think it'll be a question then of how the economy right now, I think, is behind Republicans and behind some of that messaging, but how do they build a long-term coalition around that? We saw in 2016, for instance, Trump's focus on immigration did repel a lot of Latino voters, even though immigration is rarely their top issue. It's the economy, like most voters, right? But it's still that language and rhetoric alienated a lot of Latino voters. And you could see that if the Republican Party doesn't move away from some of the ways in which it talks about immigration, particularly in targeting Latino Americans, that could be a problem for them moving forward. And then I think too, we kind of say in blanket terms, non-white versus white. I think it really is what we're seeing, though, among like Latino voters. I think there's some evidence that you're also seeing among Asian American voters a shift towards Republicans. There's a lot less polling on that. It's very hard to poll different groups in that vein. It's just very unclear to me because at the same time this is happening, you have someone like John Fetterman running in Pennsylvania for Democrats, right, for the Senate there, who is pitching kind of a working class message. And I don't think the two parties have fully kind of grappled out who is going to ultimately own that message. I think the Democrats at this point still have more like infrastructure in place to have that message work than Republicans. But, if more working class voters shift towards Republicans, I think that leans in their favor. But I think it's a muddy message right now, and neither party is really fully focused on those voters.
Yeah, I think that your tension with the tension in the Democratic coalition that is.
It seems to me like it should be really important whether each party is getting strong. Oh.
Yeah, I think your Discord is muted.
Yeah, sorry, my bad. It seems to me like it should be really important whether each party is getting stronger among the same demographics where they're already strong and those are just getting more extreme versus like whether they're losing support where they're strong now and gaining support where they're weak now. Like it seems, regardless of which specific demographics that's happening in, I would expect that to have a big effect on how extreme their rhetoric is, and the idea is that like House districts in particular have certain demographic trends within each district, and if parties are getting stronger where they are already strong, then essentially it's going to lead to them nominating candidates in primaries that are more extreme because they have less need to cater to moderate voters, and then you just get.
Or sorry, you can finish.
Sorry, what's that?
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. Yeah, you can keep going.
Oh yeah. So anyway, the outcome that I was anticipating, and I think this has already happened to some degree, is that you just end up with a House of Representatives full of far left and far right people with fewer moderates. If the country overall is heading in that direction, where each demographic is strongly in favor of one party or the other.
Yeah, and I think you already. I don't think it's not a coincidence. I think like AOC, Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib, Marjorie Taylor Greene, Lauren Boebert. These are all people that are in the House of Representatives that definitely have more farther left and farther right views, whether or not you agree or disagree with them. And you've seen this happen in the past. When the Tea Party kind of wrecked the Republican Party, that was in the House of Representatives. It was John Boehner, who was Chief of the House, that was having trouble wrangling all the crazy Republicans into line. And it was his second in command, Eric Cantor. He got unseated by a Tea Party challenger. That was then the sort of the switch that John Boehner pulled to retire, because his right-hand man got primaried by some, Tea Party crazy, and he couldn't control them anymore. So yeah, I think you have seen this play out before. You're seeing it now, and it's going to continue in the future because a lot of these blue and red districts are becoming more blue and more red.
Yeah, so it seems like the blue districts becoming more blue and the red districts becoming more red. There's a few different ways that this is happening. One is just like people are self-sorting, right? It seems like people are just migrating to cities or out of cities depending on which ideological group or cultural group of people they want to live among. And then gerrymandering is a thing also. But I guess I'm trying to relate this back to the trends that they were pointing out, where like Democrats are gaining more support among white college-educated people, and losing support among Latinos. But neither of those groups was one where they had extremely high or extremely low support to begin with. So I guess I'm just trying to, I don't know, like as relating to that specific issue, maybe this thing that I'm bringing up isn't that relevant.
I think it's a really multifactored issue where, working class people are going to care a lot more about bread and butter issues, but there's also a huge wealth of social issues, especially on the right. You can bring all the jobs you want, but there's a big chunk of Republican voters who are going to hear, oh, you're pro-abortion? Okay, I'm never voting for you in my life. Right? It doesn't matter. So I think these are like really and I think you actually see this with Latino voters. A lot of, I think, the appeal that conservatives have is against, the crazy, left-wing wokeness that does not do very well outside of the Twitter crowd, which is very disproportionately white. I think there are a lot of factors that lead to working class people not aligning with the Democrats as much. And I think they're both bread and butter issues, things like the economy and inflation. But then I think there's also a great degree to which the more radical social issues that the left wing of the Democratic Party preaches that just sort of contribute to this opinion of like, oh, Democrats are these crazy woke, screeching feminists. There's a real evocative picture of that I think is painted in the minds of a lot of average working class people that, and I don't think they're entirely wrong either. And that's another thing that really hurts, I think, the Democratic Party's appeal.
Yeah, and it's been said many times that Donald Trump was kind of a backlash against that.
Yep.
Sort of evident in the contrast between a Tim Ryan or a Fetterman and a Buttigieg or a Connor Lamb is really interesting. And in this sort of split between populism and a sort of, technocratic liberalism that I think you sort of see playing out at the voter level. It's sort of harder to see that clean split playing out at the political in terms of the way politicians are behaving. It's not like you see a Democratic politicians leaning in to free trade yet, right? You could imagine some world where now the Republicans have taken the anti-immigration and anti-trade half of the ledger, that Democrats would really lean forcefully into being pro-immigration, being pro-trade, on sort of clearly representing the other half of the spectrum. And they're not doing that yet. And part of the reason is because they continue to be dependent on white working class voters in the Midwest who have outsized influence in the battleground states and the Electoral College. And those voters are clearly not aligned with sort of the college-educated white cosmopolitan worldview. But over the longer run, as demographic trends continue, you could come closer to a breaking point there where Democrats sort of more forcefully own their own caricature and become the sort of globalist party that they're accused of being. The Republicans, on the other hand, have their own version of that in terms of like whether they're going to keep embracing large tax cuts for corporations and to what extent their sort of business agenda is inconsistent with the populist agenda. My own view is that it's not really. I mean, if you look historically to the 19th century, it's sort of the pre-industrial era in some ways. Oddly enough, it's interesting that would be the analogy today, but we are watching the industrial era now sort of fade. After all, right? Unionization is dropping, manufacturing is dropping. That clash between labor and capital is no longer the defining political fault line of our politics. And so it's interesting that back in the days before all of that existed, that it was common for populism to be, linked to smaller government. Jacksonian Democrats, for instance, were, people often compared to often compared Jackson and Donald Trump as being sort of analogous political figures. And even though Jackson was a party of small government and wasn't arguing for welfare handouts or anything like that, it was a different era when you could attract working class voters in a different way. And I think that there's something to the idea that you can still be a populist while still being for small government and not supporting a large welfare state.
So we've gone pretty broad and we've cast forward quite a bit here. I want to bring us back to sort of the most immediate political question at hand, which is perhaps the midterms. Traditionally, we think of a midterm electorate as being older, whiter, and more inclined to have a college degree than the electorate in a general presidential election. Do these trends suggest then that Democrats will better be able to stem a backlash against sort of Biden and the economy and the direction of the country than they would have with their electorate 15 years ago? Their coalition 15 years ago?
I think the short answer to that is almost unequivocally yes. And you can see in the fundraising numbers right now that even at this tough moment for Democrats, that the people who are most engaged in American politics right now, that cream of the crop, includes people who are willing to donate their dollars to political candidates, includes plenty of Democrats. In our own likely voter model, the Democrats are only losing about 2 points compared to Republicans at the moment. And, that is in part a reflection of a reversal of the relationship between partisanship and likelihood of voting. Back in 2016, when we were building turnout models, Republicans led among the likeliest voters, and Democrats had a wide lead, 20, 30 points among people who we thought were unlikely to vote. That's the opposite in our most recent poll. In fact, it's part of the reason why Joe Biden has lower approval rating in our poll than other surveys. Among people who voted in both the 2018 election and have voted in a primary, the very likeliest voters in our view, Joe Biden's approval rating is 41%. Among voters who haven't voted in any recent election, his approval rating is in the low 20s. So the Democrats have, there is an underlying pattern at the moment where the most engaged voters are relatively likely to be Democrats. What cuts against that, though, is that within each of those groups, among high turnout voters, among low turnout voters, I would still think that the Republicans are likelier to vote than Democrats because there is this unfavorable national political environment. And I would guess that will outweigh the demographic advantages among white voters that we're talking about here. And so I would still expect the Republicans to have a turnout edge. But back in 2014, there are some estimates that say the Democrats had like a 7-point disadvantage due to turnout in that midterm election nationwide. I don't know if that's true or not. I haven't tried to calculate it myself, but I would be very surprised if it was at quite that level in 2022, given both the high level of participation that we expect and this reversal in the underlying relationship between turnout and partisanship.
It is interesting right now, given where we are in the cycle, that Democrats still have like a slight advantage in the generic ballot polling, especially given where Biden's approval rating is. The two factors are not necessarily related. If you're trying to figure out how people will vote in the midterm, definitely look at the generic ballot poll over Biden's approval, because, you can still disapprove of the president, be a Democrat, and want Democrats to control Congress. I think, though, while some of the coalitional shift, as Nate is speaking to, helps Democrats in the sense that, white college-educated voters, highly engaged, want to turn out, it is a small portion, though, of Democrats' base. And if they can't motivate other components of that base to turn out, I think that could be a real problem for Democrats here in the midterms. And I think the other thing I've learned now from the 2018 midterms and 2020 in particular is that it seems like we're done with the era of low turnout elections. Maybe I'll be proven wrong here in 2022, but from that kind of starting point, I'm a little skeptical that either side will have low turnout, just because we have not seen that in previous elections here.
One thing that helps the Democrats a little bit in the short term is that a lot of the most competitive races, not all of them, but a lot of them, are in disproportionately white districts or states. And that will not in any way insulate Democrats from low turnout among Black or Latino voters, but it does slightly mitigate the effect of it compared to our national poll, for example.
So you're talking like Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, New Hampshire, because obviously there are other states where there are competitive Senate elections like Georgia, Nevada, Arizona, where you would expect that to not be the case, right?
Definitely. Though even in those states, like Arizona is about as white as the nation as a whole. So if we're talking about national, when the baseline is the national.
It's just been kind of conventional wisdom for a long time that higher turnout is supposed to favor Democrats.
Cricket, and lower... I think you're muted again.
Oops. Sorry. It's been conventional wisdom for a long time that higher turnout is supposed to favor Democrats and lower turnout is supposed to favor Republicans, and the idea being that the most high propensity dedicated voters who show up every time are like the older white people who were always voting Republican, right? And so it seems like maybe that's less true today than it used to be.
It is something that I think Democrats are having to learn the hard way, is that if you, especially like speaking about the Hispanic vote previously, that was a group that I think really sort of hit sideline Democrats, where I think a lot of Democratic strategists assumed like, oh, okay, we need to get people that can speak Spanish out to vote because they're going to hate Donald Trump because he's racist, and that was not nearly as true as they thought it was going to be. That there needs to be more done, not just to get people out and vote, but to convince. And I think you're really starting to see that the turnout is really not just generically helping. Turnout just doesn't really generically help Democrats anymore. It's only in specific circumstances, especially when we talk about specific areas where it isn't necessarily the case that Democrats just automatically have, the population. That's starting to only become true in very specific areas, which then massively contribute to the national picture, right? But if in terms of population, Democrats are really only clear and ahead of Republicans in like, let's say 30 counties out of like let's say 500 that are in America, well then for something that is just a national vote, sure, turnout does generically help Democrats, but very few things are actually like that in America. Most things are going to be dealing with some sort of proportional voting based off of like districts or counties, and when that's the case, then it really isn't the case that you just need to get everyone out and going to vote. You need to be getting the people that support you, and you need to be creating people that support you in the areas where it counts.
Yeah. So then there was this like particular weird issue in 2020 with the whole like mail-in ballot thing that's probably an anomaly. I wouldn't expect something like that to happen again, but that was like kind of crazy the way the turnout dynamic happened.
Yeah, well, I mean, Republicans really have no one to blame but themselves. The fact that it was overwhelmingly used by left-wing voters. There is legitimately a real case to be made for like Donald Trump. If you combine the number of Republican voters that died because of the coronavirus and the number of Republican voters that would have voted if Donald Trump had said that mail-in voting wasn't going to be rigged and ended up not voting, if those two groups had been able to get out and vote, Donald Trump might still be the president. Which is just really crazy to think about.
Yeah.
Political survey, I think that in a lot of the states and also in competitive districts that this story could be a little bit different, but that's not to say that this problem doesn't exist. It just slightly mitigates it in certain geographic areas.
Nate, what did you make about this split between Biden's approval and the generic ballot polling? And as a reminder, generic ballot polling is essentially when pollsters just ask folks, do you plan on voting for a Republican or Democrat for Congress? And that's the number we pay the most attention to in trying to, cast forward how the midterms might go. But we also usually pay a good deal of attention to the presidential approval rating because historically it is pretty indicative of, how many seats a party might lose at the midterms. So to reiterate, in this poll, Biden's approval rating is at 33%, whereas, support for Democratic control of Congress is at 41% compared to support for Republican control at 40%. That changes slightly when you put a likely voter model on those numbers to Republicans having a 1-point advantage instead of Democrats. But still, that's much closer than, if you just told me Biden's approval rating in this poll is 33%, what do you expect the generic ballot polling to be? I would maybe guess something more like, I don't know, a 5-point spread than a 0 to 1 point spread. Yeah. So like, Sarah said you can be, as Sarah said, you can be a Democrat, not approve of Biden, and quite frankly, in this poll, Biden's approval rating amongst Democrats is at 70%. So it seems like there are lots of Democrats who don't approve of Biden's job performance, and still want Democrats to control the House or the Senate or what have you. Is that the whole story? Like, is there more to it than that?
One challenge that Democrats have in this poll is who's undecided, and alternately, if you want to think of it that way, who is decided? In our poll, only 7% of white voters with a college degree are undecided. The rest of the electorate, it's more than 20% undecided. So, we talk about white college graduates being a potential turnout advantage for Democrats, but they're also just more plugged in politically. They are likelier to have an opinion at this point about who should control Congress. I should note that our generic ballot question is asking people whether they prefer Democrats or Republicans to control Congress, and many people haven't even begun to think about that yet. Joe Biden's approval rating among the undecided voters is like 23%, if my memory is right, and that's a group that's overwhelmingly working class. So, if voters aren't beginning to think about the midterm election yet in nationalized terms, except those highly educated people who right now are pretty Democratic, I think it's easy to see why right now that generic ballot question might start out looking pretty good for them, but that could potentially change very quickly once the midterm race really gets underway.
Yeah. And also, one thing we did see post-Dobbs is there was a shift in these generic ballot polls towards Democrats on average. And I think it's an open question of how much that shift continues. It's a different issue, but in the polling we've been doing with Ipsos, we've already seen a dip in terms of the number of Americans who say that gun violence and crime is important to them. We went out into the field a few days after Uvalde, and you saw a huge spike in that. So it is kind of, if anything, too, when you look historically at this poll, it gets worse for the party in the White House as time goes on. And so I think you can expect, presumably, I think it's an important point to what Nate said at the very outset, where there are certain factors happening in our politics right now that make it really hard to predict things as normal, right? But using the historical precedent, you should expect Republicans to gain a few points here. But it might not be a red wave. I think that's kind of what we've been talking about internally is, very early in the 2018 midterms, you saw a huge advantage for Democrats on the generic ballot. You're not seeing that for Republicans this year.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see whether all of these new issues, I knew is the wrong word for it, but resurgent issues, abortion and guns remain the center of national attention for the rest of the campaign. But I think that as long as they do remain a major focal point, that feels like it creates a bit of a floor for Democrats. It's easy to imagine the Democrat who would ordinarily stay home, who feels motivated when abortion rights and democracy feel like they're at stake. It's easy to imagine the moderate Republican who voted for Biden, who would really prefer to be voting for Romney Republicans all the time, but really has to think twice when the Republican nominee, supports a ban on abortion and thinks that Donald Trump is a legitimate winner of the election. A lot of the factors that you would ordinarily expect to be pushing towards the Democrats, or rather pushing towards the Republicans, now have, at least for the moment, an important countervailing force that we don't usually have in the historic record. The historic record is very clear on what we should expect to happen this November, and it is my instinct, like Sarah's, that will prevail in the end. There are things about this moment that are different, and whether that adds up to the whole this time will end up being different in terms of the electoral outcome is a totally separate question. It's usually not different after all. But if it was the day after the election, and it was
Imagine
different,
those headlines.
we would not struggle to tell the story. It would be easy. We could all write what that article is going to say. And so when it's that easy to come up with why we could distinguish this moment, at least have to be open to the possibility that it will prove to be maybe only slightly different. Maybe it just means that the Democrats can stay competitive in the Senate.
So a couple of months ago, you and I had a conversation about Roe versus Wade and how we thought that might affect the November elections. Do you have any? I don't know. Do you still have the same opinions on that you had a couple of months ago?
I would say broadly, yes. It really depends on how prescient does it stay in people's minds. Are there going to be, continuing in the next couple months, decently sized stories about, some 10-year-old girl having to go to a different state to get an abortion until she doesn't die? Because if that is the case, then I think that's going to be a huge asset to Democrats. And especially in more close races where there is a large sort of suburban vote that of people that, we might describe as more like moderate Republicans that might even be a little Trumpy, but are not at all even very much do not want to live in a world where abortions are not the case. I think the suburban mom vote is something that often gets talked about as a really big swing factor that can go for Republicans or Democrats. And it really just comes down to, is this going to be prescient in people's minds for the next 2-3 months? And if so, I think it can be a massive factor for Democrats, because so much of these elections isn't really changing people's minds. It's just how motivated is your voting base and how demotivated is the opposing side's voting base.
I think I've changed my mind slightly to be a little bit closer to what your point of view is on it. So, because what I was saying a couple months ago was I didn't expect it to have any large partisan effect, because even if it remains kind of central to our national political discourse, like if it's the number one issue, I was thinking that would still be very motivating to both sides, and it might even be more motivating to the right, because just because they've won at the Supreme Court level, that doesn't necessarily mean that they have the outcome that they want on each state level. That they still have the details of how to manage abortions and which exceptions to have and all that kind of stuff to fight over. So I kind of figured that would motivate a lot of pro-life people to turn up at the ballot, to be.
Now's a chance that we have now that the Supreme Court's out of the way, we can actually implement these laws now.
Yeah. So that was my way of thinking a couple months ago. And I still think there's some truth to that, but I think I'm slightly warming up to the idea that it might be more advantageous for Democrats than I was thinking before. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I think there's definitely groups on both sides that are going to be more motivated to vote as a result, but I just think it is going to lean so much heavier in the side of motivating Democrats, because for them it's like they're going from having had something to now losing it, and I think there's probably a lot of Democratic voters that took that for granted and are now kind of like, oh shit, wait, this is on stake, like this is like at stake on the ballot. Fuck me, I didn't even realize that.
Yeah, loss aversion is a big thing in psychology. It's like people have a stronger emotional reaction to losing something that they already have, as opposed to the prospect of gaining something they don't currently have. Yeah.
They lose 15 House seats or something. I don't expect the Democrats to actually win this election in some sense. But could it be enough to prevent the wave that we would expect? That seems possible to me. I wouldn't want to rule that out.
It's of course important to remember that in the same way that the issue environment changed relatively rapidly, and we ended up with a good number of high propensity voters saying that they were concerned about abortion and gun control and issues surrounding democracy, the issue environment can change again. Like just last fall, of course, during the Virginia gubernatorial election, everyone was talking about critical race theory. In this poll, only 4% of voters combined, you found, said that education, crime, or immigration was the most important issue facing the country.
Yep.
I don't think people would have guessed that last fall. I think they would have guessed that Republicans would have been able to make those issues sort of salient in an enduring way until the midterms. Obviously, the Dobbs decision and Uvalde and other mass shootings and the January 6th committee has changed all that. But as you're all suggesting, things can change again. And of course, Dobbs is different. It's like a huge win for the party that's quote unquote out of power. So I guess we'll have to see and continue tracking this stuff. Let's talk a little bit about the potential 2024 matchups, which you dug into in this polling and found some interesting information. Looking ahead to 2024, you found that a majority of Democrats, 64%, don't want Biden to run again. And the leading reasons were age and job performance, not really his politics per se. In this polling, do we have some kind... Well, first of all, is that number surprising? And second of all, perhaps the more interesting question, do we have any indication of what kind of candidate Democrats do want?
I did think it was surprising. I didn't know what to expect, but I expected higher than whatever the number in the 20s that Biden got was. But we don't have a very good idea of what candidate Democrats prefer. I'd argue that the 2020 primary may still be our best indication of where Democrats are at from an ideological standpoint or from an electability versus policy preference standpoint. And we saw a very divided and fractured field in 2020. So I think Democrats probably would split deeply again, based on whether they want someone more who's a democratic socialist or another neoliberal or a more mainstream Democrat. I think all of those sort of voters have important constituencies in the party, and I think that obviously gives Biden a very real chance to prevail even in a contested primary, because it's going to be difficult to unify the opposition unless you're a very strong candidate. And although we didn't ask about it, my view is that there is no obvious person to fill that role in the Democratic Party right now.
Of course, you did ask about it in the Republican Party, which we will talk about. Sarah, I'm curious what you thought of this, but like in response to what Nate said about the 2020 primary, to what do you attribute this almost like whiplash, where Biden was consistently the most popular Democrat in the 2020 primary, but voters have now turned on him pretty decisively.
Well, Biden was the most consistent. I was actually going to talk about this earlier, that, we look at early primary polls, so a year out. So starting in 2019, we were looking at the field and building it out as it became an unwieldy field of 20 plus candidates. And you're right, that Biden was always leading, but it wasn't a super overwhelming lead, right? So that left opportunities then for someone like Harris to have a moment, for someone like Warren, for someone like Sanders. He was always the front runner in the early primary polls that we had, but it was never an overwhelming front runner. He was the consensus candidate, right? And I think, we'd done a piece earlier that was looking at how unusual is it that so many people don't want Biden to run again. And what we found is previous polls for presidents, whether it's Reagan, Clinton, have found that Americans don't want that president to run again. Generally speaking, though, it hasn't been as high as the numbers for Biden, particularly among members of his own party. And I think that's what's really staggering there. I think that where we see the dilemma for Democrats is when you do the head-to-head Biden-Trump, Biden still prevails. Granted, as Nate was saying, they didn't ask about other Democrats, but we have seen in other polls, Harris does weaker against Trump, Buttigieg does weaker against Trump. And I think that's kind of the real dilemma that Democrats have, this idea that Biden's too old, he shouldn't be president, but who should be president instead? And I think there's an interesting argument that Democrats, similar to Republicans, are kind of moving in this direction in vein of wanting more of a fighter candidate. I think you see that with candidacies like Fetterman. But I don't know how much of that appeal resonates with the rest of the Democratic base. Because I think one thing we lose sight of oftentimes is that when you look at the ideologies of the party, yes, a lot of Republicans, they only identify as conservative. There's not a huge moderate contingency. And yes, very liberal and somewhat liberal are big factions of the Democratic base, but so are moderate voters. And I think that kind of inevitably brings up the tensions then of who's going to be able to appeal to all the different sections of the Democratic base. And if someone only ran that appealed to college-educated white voters, I don't know if that would be a winning coalition for Democrats.
Yeah, it is not easy to come up with a candidate who is positioned to beat Biden if Biden ran, who has the ability to appeal broadly throughout the Democratic Party, who has the name recognition and fundraising ability to make up for the likelihood that many party elites are going to stay on Biden's side, and who would be a credible candidate in the general election. There just aren't many people who you can come up with who fit that bill. It's easy to come up with people who could win if Biden doesn't run, but I think it's very difficult to come up with the people who have a chance to be competitive against him if he seeks re-election. There's no Ted Kennedy against Carter in 1980.
Yeah. Sarah, you mentioned different factions of the Democratic Party. And speaking of those different factions and different sort of values and goals, one finding in the Times Siena poll that got a good amount of play was that 94% of Democrats under the age of 30 wanted a nominee who isn't Biden. Now, of course, you already mentioned this, Nate, but in polls, the more you dig into small populations and the crosstabs, the greater the margin of error is. And the sample of young Democrats, I think, was like 56 people. And so I think we would probably caution against reading too much into that 94% number. I mean, well, first of all, do you agree with that? Like, would you caution against reading too much into that? Or do you think that that's probably fairly representative?
I would definitely caution against reading too far into it. I mean, we're talking about an unbalanced sample of 50 people. It's not weighted within that subgroup. I mean, I can't tell you with any confidence whether those 50 people are representative of all young people. But, when you're at 94, there's a lot of room to be off and still have fundamentally the same basic finding.
Yeah, and I think the one thing working in the Times' favor is that other polls have also shown a real problem for Biden among young voters as well.
And he got pummeled in 2020 among the group. So in the Democratic primary.
Yes, primary, not the general.
So I think that part of the reason that this has gotten so much attention, both in the Times poll and in other polls, is because we generally think of young people as disproportionately supporting the Democratic Party as being, key portions, like a key portion of the Obama coalition that the Democratic Party has, been wanting to recreate for some time. Why is Biden performing so poorly with not just young people, but also young people who identify with the Democratic Party?
Why should he be performing well among young people who are Democrats right now? I mean, I'm serious. I mean, he's if we just take their stated concerns in the poll, they're concerned about his age, his competence, his performance as president. Some of them are progressive too, and are they that? We look at the overall situation in the country right now, where the core promise of the Biden presidency in terms of like unity hasn't happened. The economy is not in a good position. The president's agenda is stalled in Congress, and it's not as ambitious as they would like anyway. I mean, and he has never been their favorite. I think that you can make a case that maybe someone should just be sympathetic to him as a matter of him being an incumbent president. But he was never the favorite of this group, and I would almost flip it around. Why would you expect Biden to have more support?
Well, I think the expectation hinges on the idea that this was his best group in the general. But I think that is a sharp point that it was not true in the primary. And I think it does speak to your point, though, overall, of what can they point to be happy about. I think there was a lot of fanfare when Biden was first elected, and then the surprise, to be quite honest, of Democrats winning both seats in Georgia and then having a trifecta, but then Democrats not really acting on a lot of the stated ambitions they had going into the presidency.
I mean, seriously, just to play. I'm curious. This is a brainstorming exercise. What is, if you were to try and tell a young Democrat to be happy with him? I mean, what would be your pitch? It's not easy to come up with right now, and I think it's a useful
Change
exercise.
is slow. Think how bad the alternative could be.
I mean,
Young
yeah,
Democrat.
it's like I don't know.
Yeah. But like
But that's not a very good
they probably
message.
are fine
I
with
get
the
it.
Democratic alternatives, though. But they probably like the Democratic alternatives more. As the Democratic primary in 2020 indicates. They're not.
But it seems like sort of the young progressive vision of like spend a lot of money and don't even necessarily worry about the deficit was the strategy that was employed. And it got us the tightest labor market in most people's memory. And so people who are graduating from college are getting jobs. I mean, they might be annoyed about inflation, but it's way easier to get a job today than it was when I graduated from college in 2012. So, to a certain extent, the progressive part of the party got what it wanted, which was lots and lots of spending. It got some of that under Trump's presidency because obviously, the provisions for like stimulus spending and like PPP and all that stuff were, holed up in the House by House Democrats, even though Trump was president. But in a way, they got what they wanted.
I don't think that they think they got what they wanted. I mean, you can try and make that pitch, but what they wanted was the huge reconciliation bill that reflected this ambitious, idealistic vision of a government that did more to help people across almost every dimension of life, from child care to expanded Medicare benefits, and it's not.
But do you really think that's why young people are unhappy? Because I understand that that's maybe why young college-educated.
No, but I mean in terms of whether you can pitch them that they're getting what they wanted.
That's why young college-educated progressive.
No, but if you're talking about whether they got what they wanted, I think it's relevant.
I mean, so that's why young college-educated progressive people might be sort of disappointed. But obviously, most young people aren't those things. And so why are the rest of young people unhappy? Just inflation and general, the guy's old, stuff like that?
I think it goes beyond that. I mean, there's several arguments you could make about our politics and what's the most essential, whether it's where you live, rural-urban splits, whether it's you went to college or not. I also think, though, generational divides. Age is a really big factor in our politics. We saw this in the 2016 primary on the Democratic side between Clinton and Sanders. You saw it again in 2020 with, again, Sanders' coalition was primarily driven by younger voters. As Nate pointed out, younger voters at that stage in the election process were Biden's weakest link, right? But I think more so than that just being isolated to Biden then, there's this sense of what are Democratic politicians actually doing in Congress. I'm a younger person. In my lifetime, Roe was or access to abortion, or at least the right to abortion, was taken for granted. Now that's taken away. What are Democrats doing to fight back against that? I think we're living in this period of upheaval, and you're having young voters kind of come into adulthood, having had a lot of things taken for granted, essentially, and now those are in real jeopardy of being overturned. And then perhaps you are more critical of the political party that seems to not be doing anything on those fronts, or as fast as you would want, right? Like climate change, I think, is a huge issue, predominantly among younger voters. Some of these social issues, you just see time and again, really big age gaps. And so I think when action doesn't happen on those issues as fast as you would like, that can really breed strong dissatisfaction and disillusionment with the party as well.
All right, so as you mentioned, you didn't poll alternatives for Biden, but you did poll alternatives for Trump. And what you found in a hypothetical 2024 Republican presidential primary is that 49% of likely Republican primary voters support Trump, 25% support Ron DeSantis, followed by Ted Cruz, Mike Pence, and Nikki Haley, who are all in the single digits. That's about in the range of other national polling that we've seen. And in the Times analysis, I'm sure a lot of people saw, sort of leading the Times last week, the headline was like half of GOP voters are ready to leave Trump behind.
Yeah.
So just on that last topic that they were talking about a minute ago, I was thinking about something that calls back to the documentary we were watching a couple weeks ago, which is that in some ways we're kind of still living in like FDR's America, right? Like to a large degree, like the role that the government plays in our life was defined in like the 1930s, and so which was seen as very progressive and maybe even radical at the time. Like FDR was, by a lot of people, was seen as kind of a radical leftist, and some conservatives probably still see him that way today. But it does make sense to me that people who are leftists today are not going to be satisfied with a continuation of the same kind of relationship with the government and society that we've had for 90 years.
Yeah, I think it's sort of the catch-22 of uh winning in that way, is that even the most conservative Republican isn't going to get rid of Medicare or Medicaid anytime soon because we've won on those issues. But equally, now it means that we can't even use those as issues for the left to win on. We can't be like, yeah, we're the party of Medicare and Medicaid, because Republicans like those. And the more left-wing part of our own party is no longer satisfied by just those things. I think what the woman was talking. I'm sorry, I probably shouldn't call her the woman. What the other member of 538 that was not currently on screen was talking about in regards to young people being disillusioned, I think it's super, super true, and a really big problem. Young voters just don't get out and vote enough and are very unsatisfied, I think, by the status quo in ways that I think they probably should be. I think they are mistaken when they think about, we're doomed on, I think if you polled most like 20 somethings on climate change, they'd be like, oh, it's too late. We're already, and it's like, this is not the case at all. I think that their understanding of what the Democratic Party is doing is a lot more negative than what the Democratic Party is actually doing. It's just this problem of, doing good things is slow and boring and takes time and isn't flashy. And while bad things are happening in the media, every 10 seconds, we also only get like 10 seconds allocated to good things. Like Biden's infrastructure bill or the gun control package, the first one in 30 years. Those were both like blips on the radar, even though they're massive big deals. But like we hear about them for like a week and then we're on to the next issue.
Yeah, so if it turns out that the Roe versus Wade overturn really is massively motivating to the left, then I guess that would be a data point in favor of this kind of view that you're expressing, where like perhaps people need need something to be in danger to motivate them. You know what I mean? Like because
Yep.
people see Medicare and Social Security as things that aren't going to be overturned anytime soon, like they don't care that much about it. But suppose we really were on the verge of losing Medicare and Social Security, then perhaps that's what you need to to motivate people on the left,
Yep.
which is kind of sad. It's like, you know, it sucks that like imminent danger seems to be the kind of underlying.
You almost want to, yeah, you almost want to false flag, like let the Republicans win on like some hugely unpopular issue that normally they don't have to accept the consequences for, and be like, yeah, guys, look, we lost Medicare because of these Republicans, and then just like get a massive sweep of like Democrats to then like actually get huge change through. It almost reminds me of the Civil War a little bit, insofar as in a way, we're almost lucky that the southern states seceded and then gave up all their political power, because we just rammed through a ton of shit, because those states remained as like military districts for a while, even after the war. If the southern states had stayed in and just dragged their heels for decades and decades and decades, who knows how long it would have taken us to actually like outlaw slavery. I mean, maybe it would have effectively have been gone. But if you look, I mean, it took us until like the 60s to really get rid of like segregation. And you really kind of shudder to wonder like how long could those states have like dragged their heels out and done really bad things, or maintained really bad things. And it's almost a blessing that they went for a much more radical approach and then gave us the ability to get our things through, as opposed to the much more effective approach of just being obstinate.
Okay, so here's the new plan. We pick like 20 states that we don't agree with, and we get them to temporarily secede from the union for like 5 years, and then
Texas, please secede, Texas. Oh my God, please! Please secede. Let us get everything fixed with America, and then when your budget implodes in 2 years, like you can come back. Oh my, that would just be amazing.
yeah, we just pass like 5 or 6 constitutional amendments to while they're gone.
We'll get some zoning reform in. Get some. When they come back, we don't let them keep the name Texas. Just a couple.
Yeah.
He still leads the field, of course, by 24 points. So help us sort of put that in context. Like, is this bad news for Trump, or is this decent news for Trump?
I mean, it depends on your expectations. And I think that for Trump, given the level of dominance that he's had over the Republican Party, including convincing the majority of Republican voters and elected officials to go along with a stolen election story that, goes against all of the evidence, that it is, to me, surprising that he is as vulnerable as he seems to be in a primary. To me, 49-26, if I'm remembering the numbers right, that feels like Clinton Obama 08 at the outset, more than it feels like Clinton Sanders at the outset, let alone a candidate who's on track to win without a contested primary. And so if your baseline, if your benchmark here is here's a guy who's commanded total unity from his party to this point, then I think these are surprisingly disappointing numbers. By basically any other measure, they're pretty good. He's still the favorite to win, and there's no point in taking that away from him or something like that. But I think that if you're accustomed to seeing someone who, again, I use the word dominance, who exercises dominance over his party, who has been able to stifle opposition even when it has been more than it deserved, that the weakness is noteworthy.
I think I would push back on that. You're right that there has been an attrition, even among Republican voters, in regards to Trump. But when I think about this kind of historically for what the field has looked like and what that means for primary polls results, Trump should win. He's roughly kind of where Biden was going into the first half of 2019. He's actually above Biden. We had Biden at 31.6%, but then it was a similar situation where no other candidate was super close. And yes, like DeSantis is not that far off, but is DeSantis more of a coalitional candidate than Trump? I don't know. Are they competing for the same voters? What do the different coalition maneuverings look like among the Republican Party? I think it's telling that this far out, he's still the front runner. We'll see as time goes on where we are in 2023. But at this point, it does look like his primary, his nomination.
Yeah, I agree with all that. The only thing I'd say on the framing point is that Donald Trump is a former president, and I don't think that the comparison between him and most other primaries is necessarily the salient one. I mean, we don't have very many cases of people returning for, to try and run for a third presidential run in recent memory. I mean, I guess maybe I honestly can't remember offhand whether there's any example in the modern polling data of having too many. I don't know. Were people asking about whether George H.W. Bush should run again in '96? Maybe. I doubt anyone was asking about Carter running again in '84. Maybe it's in there somewhere. With that context in mind, that given that he basically, won the Republican nomination in an uncontested fashion in 2020, and that he has retained support from his party through so many deeply challenging moments, that this is a sign of weakness in the data that has not always existed for this person. This is all speculative at this point. We'll see what kind of campaign DeSantis runs. I actually think he is fairly well positioned to run a campaign that can unify all of the major constituencies against Trump. That's partly because Trump has alienated the constituency that DeSantis is weakest among, sort of never Trumper type anti, pro-democracy people who are opposed to Trump's conduct and his January 6th stuff and, think he violates law and so on. That group of people, I think, is going to vote against Trump no matter what. But DeSantis also has the ability, I think, to speak to people on the right who could potentially have issues with Donald, who potentially in a primary could wind up thinking that DeSantis is a closer candidate to them on a lot of issues. I can imagine DeSantis critiquing Donald Trump for bringing Anthony Fauci into everyone's lives. I can imagine him complaining that he sent out the $2,000 stimulus checks that are responsible for inflation. I can imagine DeSantis saying, you didn't get the wall done. I can imagine DeSantis saying, I won in Florida by more than you did. And I would win this time. So I think he has the ability, and he has this proven record from a conservative standpoint of, taking on political correctness and liberals in the state and being a fighter and so on. So I can see him managing to hold the dissent against Trump on both his left and his right that, at least in theory, on paper, gives him interesting potential down the line. In sort of a similar way, I go back to Barack Obama. Obviously, DeSantis and Obama are very different political figures, but Obama also had some of that ability in that he could at once appeal to the sort of moderates who thought Hillary Clinton just had too much baggage, and that Obama said he was going to be bipartisan and so on. While on the other end of the spectrum, he was anti-war and could appeal to some people who were critical on her left. And I think that DeSantis has some of those features, even if the specifics are vastly different than they were.
Such a true point and super important. The ability to basically almost fool parts of the liberal wing of the Democratic Party that Obama had, where people just were like, oh my God, it's the first black president, he's so progressive. But he really wasn't that progressive at the time of the 2008 election, and was then able still to appeal to the moderate Democrats. That is the ability to sort of have that dual appeal is so important, I think, and it's a critical thing. I think it's actually part of the reason why Biden did well as well, is because he has much more of that rep as more of a working class Democrat, but was still able to simultaneously appeal to the sort of more left wing of the Democratic Party, just because at the end of the day, it's me or Trump, and they're horrified by Trump. I think that is just so, and I think Biden's inability to maintain that now that he isn't cast against Trump is part of the reason why you see him really weakened. It's such a powerful thing to be able to do.
So if messaging is that important, if Obama's really relatively centrist, but he had some messaging that allowed him to rope in a lot of maybe not super far left people, but at least somewhat left,
and especially young people.
I wonder if there could be a reverse version of that, somebody whose policies are actually more extreme, but who has more centrist messaging.
Yeah, I think that's also part of what has happened with Joe Biden as well, is that he's actually governed a lot more left than he initially talked about. I think, someone like oh gosh, previous governor of New Jersey, Chris Christie, has talked about this previously. And that kind of voter, like the Biden Youngkin voter, I think is probably a lot more soured on Biden than they were at the time of the 2020 election.
Yeah, Biden does not seem to get a lot of credit for governing, with left policies from people on the left, though. In any case,
Yeah, that's the thing is, yeah, people on the we've got some people on the left that are just have unrealistic expectations and are just negative. There's a bunch of negative Nancy's, Cricket. I tell you what.
I kind of agree. Like, I think there's a certain personality type, honestly, of people that are drawn to more extremist political views. Not that being on the left makes you an extremist necessarily,
Yeah.
but I sort of think the farther you get from the center, there's certain personality types that are more likely to be centrist, and certain personality types that are more likely to be like
Yes.
anti-centrist, if that makes any sense, right? And
100% agree.
people who are really just like dissatisfied will never be, will just complain about everything, or are just like highly ideological, love to just be the critic of the system. That these are the type of people you're more likely to find on the fringes.
It's almost like there's a certain kind of person who consumes the new media with the explicit purpose of like, I want to shit on this and tear it apart.
Yeah, for sure.
But is he enough of a change or just repackaged? The
I
question.
mean, he's young. He's got a young family.
I mean, in a general election or in the primary?
He is young.
Like,
I mean, that
honestly,
would be
at
quite
this
a
point,
dynamic on
anyone who's
stage,
like
that. Yeah.
below 60 feels like a change candidate by dint of just their age. Like, I don't know, maybe that's not actually true in the polling.
I think DeSantis will feel like a big change candidate depending on what issues are salient. I think that again, we went back to this at the beginning of the cycle, beginning of the conversation. Galen was pointing out that issues like immigration and crime and education have not been at the top of the ledger. But if in 2024 the issues are those are the issues, I think it's very easy to see DeSantis being the change candidate if that's what the major dimensions of conversation are now.
So there are a lot of questions that I wrote down while reading through all of this polling that we're not going to get to. So I will save them for the next round of midterm polling that you do. Before I let you go, though, Nate, I do want to get a little wonky because this is your first round of midterm polling. The last time you did a big round of polling like this was right before the 2020 election. Of course, there was significant polling error in 2020, and the polling community, us at 538, we're concerned about designing surveys that accurately reflect what Americans think, because in a democracy, that's super important. And I know that this is something that you think a lot about. What measures did you take, over the past year and a half or so to make sure that your surveys are accurately reflecting American public opinion?
First, let me just say that I'm glad you asked that, and I'm surprised that it's not the first question and that we managed to conduct these surveys without getting any real pushback.
It literally was.
I think it's a really
second question,
astonishing
but we
to
dove
me.
into the coalition. So
Okay, well, I'm glad to hear that. I do feel like we're going into this cycle, and people are just sort of back to uncritically taking polling averages. I mean, to look at this, we're talking about the Senate looking pretty good for Democrats, and it's like, wow, where have I seen good polling for Democrats in Ohio and Wisconsin before? And I'm just surprised that that people are as credulous as they seem to be. I think that there are serious issues. When you start seeing state polls of Democrats leading in Ohio and Wisconsin in this national political environment, like, how can the number one theory not be this is a story we have seen before, where state polls are failing to represent white working class voters? So I remain very concerned about this. I guess the short answer to your question in terms of what we're doing differently is still not much. There are a lot we're not doing very much differently. There are lots of things that I am considering doing, and I wanted to see how it played out in this cycle. We have a new response environment. Joe Biden's really unpopular. Take something like recalled 2020 vote choice, whether you voted for Biden or Trump in the last election. We've never asked that question before. I didn't know what kind of answers we were going to get. There are other variables that we've considered adding, like primary vote choice and so on, that I think that we just need to see on this cycle's worth of data to see what works before we implement them. I will say that the sort of measures I was looking at to try and evaluate whether 2022 polling felt like 2020 or 2018 or 2016 checked out pretty well. I mean, one simple measure that I have been looking at is whether white Democrats or white Republicans were likely to respond to our surveys. You may recall that in October 2019, we did some polling that showed Biden leading Trump while Trump led Warren and Sanders in the 6 battleground states. They're really the only unbiased and accurate polls that we managed to conduct in the 2020 cycle. Even though they were a year ahead of the election, they came within a point of the final result for Biden-Trump. When we conducted those surveys, white Democrats were somewhat likely to respond to the poll than white Republicans. They were 6% likelier, if my memory is right. In fall of 2020, that number had swelled to over 25%. So now we weighed on partisanship, so we still had the right number of white Democrats and white Republicans, but that may betray that there was this deeper non-response bias among Trump voters, and that Trump voters were simply less likely to respond, or Biden voters more likely to respond, if you want to put it that way. But as a consequence, there were more Democrats. But even among the Democrats there were too many Biden people, and even among the Republicans there were too many Biden people, and so on. In this poll, white Republicans were 1 percentage point likelier to respond to the survey than white Democrats. I think that doesn't prove that there's no non-response bias in the poll, but it does tell me that the non-response environment, the response environment, is very different than it was 2 years ago. And as a historical matter, we know that polling is not always as biased as it was in the last cycle. That example from 2019 to 2020 is one example. If you had used 2016 to predict the poll error in 2018, you would have had a problem. If you used 2012 to predict 2014, you would have had a problem. With that in mind, that there's no reason to assume that the polling is terribly biased at this point. And I have some tentative evidence that the environment is more conducive to accurate polling than it was 2 years ago. That said, I see zero reason to assume that some of the underlying biases are different. I would assume that I'm deeply concerned about running a state poll in Wisconsin or Ohio this cycle. I mean, I don't want to do that personally.
You're going to do it though.
If I think that we have some interesting plans, I can't divulge those plans.
Come on, break your news right here on the 538 Politics podcast.
I can't do that because I don't know that I can follow through on them quite yet. But I will say if we poll Wisconsin, we're not going to run a credulous poll of Wisconsin where we declare that Ron Johnson, not DeSantis, where Ron Johnson is down 5 points the day before the election. I mean, if we do a poll of Wisconsin that shows the Democrat ahead, I don't see how we could write a straight story that's like, Democrats are going to win Wisconsin tomorrow. I mean, maybe they will, but I've seen enough there.
So what can you tell us about your plans going forward between now and the midterms in terms of what kinds of questions you want to prod, what places you'll be polling, or what districts you'll be polling?
We don't have to make any of those decisions yet, so we haven't made any of those decisions. I can't speak to how other organizations make these decisions, but we generally reserve call center hours, and then we decide what we'll do with them closer to the election. I don't know. I can make some reasonable guesses that I'm pretty sure we're going to want to pull Georgia and Pennsylvania, but will we want to pull some House districts or not? I mean, that'll depend on what the generic ballot says. Do we decide that actually the primary season is heating up really early and maybe we ought to pull Nevada and New Hampshire, which have competitive Senate races and can do some early 2024 primary testing? Maybe those become more important than North Carolina and Wisconsin. Those we don't have to make those decisions yet, and so we haven't.
Wrapping up here, in terms of just things that you're curious about, and Sarah, obviously we're getting ready to do more polling with Ipsos as well. Given all this data that we have as something of a starting point for understanding the country heading into the midterms, what are you most curious about? In terms of where the trend line goes next, what kinds of questions you might like to continue asking, not even where you're going to poll, but the kinds of questions you want to hear Americans answer.
I'm very curious about class polarization and the various theories for why the demographic trends are what they are. There are a lot of different theories out there for why white working class and working class non-white voters are trending towards the Republicans. I think we should try and put them to the test as much as we can. I think it's a good fit for us. We do surveys off of voter registration files that gives us the ability to understand people who are registered Democrats and maybe don't identify with the party anymore. I think our surveys have always been more politically focused because they're not of the full adult population. I think that's a really fun challenge that we should try and probe out a few times. As we get closer to the election, I think the democracy questions are going to be very salient. Whether people trust the outcome, whether in some of these if we do state polling in some of the races where there are stop the steal types seeking a Secretary of State's office or the governor's race, how those attitudes are shaking out, and whether they have any effect on vote choice, particularly among people who backed Biden last time but maybe would otherwise be interested in a Republican candidate. That's really interesting to me. Not necessarily because I think it's a politically central question in terms of the horse race, but because of just the stakes for democracy and our system of government.
Yeah, no, I think that's Nate hit on the big ones there. I think I would add to that what we were talking about earlier around this idea of could this midterm election kind of challenge some of the conventional wisdom around midterms being bad for the president's party. My underlying assumption is it will be business as normal, but I think going into it, we should interrogate that more and look to see where there are cracks in that.
All right, well, we will absolutely do that. And Nate, we hope you'll come back on and talk to us the next time you get a big round of polling data. But for now, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. It was fun.
And thank you, Sarah. As usual, My name is Galen Druk. Tony Chow is in the virtual control room. Chadwick Matlin is our editorial director. Anthony Luciani is on sound editing. And Emily Vaneski is our intern. You can get in touch by emailing us at podcasts@538.com. You can also, of course, tweet at us with any questions or comments. If you're a fan of the show, leave us a rating or review in the Apple Podcast Store or tell someone about us. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you soon.
All right.
It's hard to comment on.
You're muted again.
Man, sorry. My fan keeps going, and then my mic is picking it up. I changed my audio setup, and so now I keep like muting myself to try to stop the fan noise.
Yeah.
It's a little bit hard to comment on that last few minutes of stuff that they were talking about, where it's just about polling data. I don't know. Do you have anything you want to share about that?
No, I mean, people I think are really dumb when it comes to how they engage with polls or media. It's sort of this like selective skepticism where it's like, you see a poll, okay, hold on. Oh, it shows that my candidate is ahead. All right, yeah, this is evidence that, Democrats are losing the vote. Wait a minute, shows Democrats are ahead. I mean, we all know polling is bullshit. I mean, come on. I mean, we were all there in 26. And I think the same thing happens with like mainstream media articles too. And this happens for people on the left too. Like, for example, the Washington Post is owned by Jeff Bezos. So anytime Washington Post has an article that's like, maybe we shouldn't tax billionaires into poverty, out of existence. People are like, oh, of course, Jeff Bezos just, emailing this journalist, help forcing him to write this, But then, anytime the Washington Post is reporting on something else that is like a left-leaning issue, left-leaning people be like, yeah, new Washington Post article destroys Thomas Clarence's, seditious wife who was involved in January 6th. I think that there weren't any big flaws with polling in 2016. What happened in 2016 actually was mostly in line with what the polls predicted at the time. There were particular models made off the polls that were total bullshit. But no poll was saying Donald Trump has a 0.01% chance to win. In 2020, there was a significant problem with the polling that previously had not been seen. And that does need to be addressed. And they mentioned that. But it's the thing where, this is like a really nuanced discussion that you try to have, but people are always just going to try to manipulate it to score cheap political points. And it makes it really difficult to actually discuss without someone being like, yeah, delusional Democrats think the polls are always off, or oh, well, don't you know billionaires run the media, and billionaires are all right wing. So obviously, the real truth is these discussions are like honestly just like a pre-poisoned well of misery.
I thought it was interesting. The guy, I keep forgetting these people's names, but the guy from the New York Times was saying that they were hesitant to put out a poll of Wisconsin 5 days before the election or something, just for fear that people would read too much into it. And it's kind of sad that we can't even have the data necessary to draw any conclusions just because of the fear of people misinterpreting it.
Yeah. And I think there's a real... You're starting to see, I think it reminds me of in more academic circles, you're starting to see people become more cognizant of the fact that these things can be picked up and read by almost anybody. And for example, the way that white papers were handled during the coronavirus, where some journals were almost like, we're not going to put this white paper out because, when we all read it, we're like, oh, if it's a white paper, we know not to, take this as the gospel. But then you saw what those white papers being done, that being done to white papers by ordinary people. And some journals were like, we're not actually sure about this. There started to become much more of an obligation if you're an academic, or if you're doing something very serious, to be cognizant of, okay, how is this going to be read by the public? Maybe we should be putting out some academic paper where we say that racism, you cannot be racist to black people, because when we say it, we go into all this detail and it's like, okay, sure, maybe there's something more defensible there, but then people see, University of Michigan put out an academic article, talking about how you can't be racist to black people, and they lose their minds.
Yeah. This is the problem of people only reading headlines and not even reading the article, right?
Yeah, on the one hand, I want to be like, okay, you stupid motherfuckers, read past the headline. Okay, this is your fault. But then I also want to look at the journalist and be like, you know what you're doing. You're making this for a read. Come on, dude. And it's like, I wish that people would be more responsible, but they're not going to be, okay? The thing that we don't regulate, hey, make sure when you buy food, you make sure it's not raw. No, we say, hey, if you're going to make food, we're going to force you to not make it raw. Like, and this is the this is the problem, I think, is the incentives are so out of whack for a lot of these digital publications to be, even when it's like seemingly against their own interest. Even left-wing media companies will sometimes put out these ridiculous hate rage click articles that fuel sentiment that goes against what they believe, but they just do it anyways. So yeah.
I've heard you make this analogy before about seatbelts, right? Where you kind of say this thing about how people losing their minds on the internet is this brand new problem, and we haven't yet invented the equivalent of a seatbelt to kind of make all this stuff more safe for us. And I wonder, like, do you think there's any applicability of that to this particular problem with people engaging with, like, polling data and studies and that kind of stuff on a level that they never used to?
I hope there is. This is a much more specific problem that I'm a lot more skeptical about if we necessarily have a solution for. I think there's good reason to believe that, all of human history is we solve one problem, but then the solution creates new problems. And so far, it's mostly turned out that, like, oh, we always happen to be able to come up with a solution. But, like, technically, that isn't, like, guaranteed. It isn't guaranteed that, oh, we create the internet and it has new problems. Well, there's a solution for that. Well, is there? I think there's good reason to think that broadly with the internet there is. When we talk about, like, a specific problem, like, clickbait headlines, that's one where, I mean, only time will tell. I don't think human beings are just going to up and be like, we got past this as a species. I don't think it's gonna be the case that in 2 generations people just don't fall for this stuff anymore. So I really hope we do, but I've got no idea if we will.
Yeah, I mean, if we ever do, it's got to be some very broad kind of cultural project of either educating people better or building into our media some kind of better strategies for communication or something. I mean, it's no small task.
Yep.
Okay. So do you want to shout yourself out or anything before we're done?
Yeah. What's up, guys? Thank you for watching. My name is Flowtrace. You can check me out at twitch.tv/Flowtrace and twitter.com/Flowtrace_. I am here most Wednesdays with Cricket, and you can catch me on a number of panels in the Twitch politics space: Prime K's, Death of Certainty, Somebody Online. In fact, today at 4, I'm going to be on Half Baked Takes panel. Tomorrow, I'm going to be on a Somebody Online panel. On Friday, you can check me out on Death of Certainty with Wick. Thank you very much for watching.
Yeah. Have a good week.
Yep, you too.